Welcome to the EI podcast. I'm Paul Lay, Senior Editor at Engelsberg Ideas, and I'm delighted to be joined today by the educationist Daisy Christodoulou and Nick Wright. Nicholas Wright, who's the author of Warhead and who is a neuroscientist and deals with defence and strategy. Both have appeared on the EI podcast before, so welcome back, both of you. Daisy, we're here inspired in part by a recent article that you wrote for Engelsberg Ideas called Indulgences, LLMs and the Crisis of the University. I wonder if you could just give us a quick précis of the argument there, fascinating argument that you had there, and the implications of it.
Sure, thanks, Paul. So my argument is that large language models have democratised cheating. They've made it much easier and cheaper for any student to access essentially undetectable cheating on essays. And that is a huge institutional problem for universities that I don't think they are coming up with a very good institutional response to. And the analogy I make is that it's a bit like the sale of indulgences in the medieval era. And people often think that the impact of technology on the medieval Catholic Church, that it was all about Luther printing his 95 Theses, pinning them to the church door. What is really interesting is that actually the technology is having an impact before Luther, and arguably Luther's a reactionary, not a revolutionary, because what Luther is reacting to is other priests in Germany at that time printing indulgence certificates. So that you can see these, and actually it's not just Germany. Again, people think the first book printed in English by Caxton, I think it's a copy of Chaucer. The first document printed in English by Caxton is an indulgence template. So this was quite big business, and you can see them. There's like stacks of them. They're like a pro forma. So the priest would fill in the name and date of the person buying the indulgence, and they get a certificate, and that's your like remission for sin. And the same guy who printed batches of these for the church in Germany was printing Luther's 95 Theses as well. It's the same man behind both of it. And so what I'm saying there is technology in Luther's time democratised the sale of indulgences. We tend to think of that kind of democratisation as always being a good thing, but actually it can make things incredibly unstable because wealthy people have been able to buy indulgences for centuries, been able to give lots of money to the church and get their sins forgiven. But suddenly when everyone can do it, it's not just everyone knows everyone else is doing it. And everyone's looking around going, really? And that's where I think we are right now with universities and cheating. I think that everybody is cheating. When you look at the usage numbers, so it's hard to kind of prove because is anyone going to admit it? And to the extent we have surveys, anonymous surveys, students are admitting it. But when you look at the data of the usage of what people use LLMs for, they use them to complete academic assignments.
And it goes beyond that. I mean, it's really hit me in the last couple of months or so, just how widespread it is in journalism.
Oh, completely.
We've had one case in The Guardian quite recently, which surprised me. But the temptation is enormous, particularly as journalism now is quite challenging in terms of the freelance rates that are offered. Everyone wants to do it. Everyone thinks they can do it. And here's this chance to do it without the effort, without necessarily the knowledge.
I think it's really interesting how just in the last couple of months, I'd say. Yeah. So it's interesting how these things feed through and when the technology becomes available and when it goes mainstream, because obviously ChatGPT-3, everyone started talking about it in November 2022. But I would say it's only in the last few months that the journalism issue, and I just see it again and again. You don't want to name names or anything, but I see quite high-profile, prominent, famous columnists. And the tell for me is always that word quiet or quietly. That whenever I see that, I mean, it's got to the point where there obviously are legitimate uses of quiet. But there are so many pieces where you think, oh, really? Yeah. You as well?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe we'll have to change our opinion about it. Maybe we'll just accept it.
I've changed my opinion in terms of suspicion, is that the journalists I used to admire were those who had the quick turnaround. I'd say, can you respond to this?
Yeah.
America has attacked Iran. Can you give me something tomorrow? And that would be the mark, they're good, aren't they? Now,
oh my goodness.
I want them to say, can I give me 3 days? Because I have to think about this. If they give it to me within the day, Immediately, I'm suspicious
Not-
of them.
Oh, my goodness.
Even good
But
names.
not if they're Lawrence Freedman, because that guy can give you something. With literally, you're like, he's like, I'm going on holiday tomorrow morning,
Oh, yeah.
and within about
No.
4 hours, he can give you 2,500.
No,
beautiful
there are
words.
people. There are people who
Yeah.
hold the record for that. I think
Yeah.
Mark Urban was the biggest turnaround ever. It was 45 minutes for one article
Brilliant.
from commission to delivery. But anyway,
Yeah.
these have wide implications. I mean, for you, Nick, you have come from that AI world.
Yeah.
You've been an architect.
So
of that
I mean,
AI
look, I think so. I think first of all, I thought your article was absolutely brilliant, and it made me think about this in a way I hadn't thought about it before, and I discussed it last night with people who were speaking, who were teaching at Oxford and at King's and so on, and everyone was all, and two barristers in fact. And we discussed it, and this is something we obviously have to deal with. And to give you one example about how widespread this is, I won't say which university this was at, but the chap said, well, we had these people and they'd written these beautiful essays, right, which were obviously so beautiful that they were perhaps too beautiful. So they got everyone to hand in these essays, and then what they did is they randomly selected 5 people of the 30 students in the class, and they got them to read the essays. And it was quite obvious they hadn't written their own essays, because if you can't read the essay properly, then obviously you haven't written the essay, right? So the question is, you talk about screening. Now, screening there, that in a sense unveiled the issue. But the thing is the way that you do it is you say, I am going to test you orally, right? But you have to do it ahead of time, right? That's how you stop people doing this stuff. Now, I have to say that I actually don't think that this is an enormously difficult issue to deal with fundamentally. And I'll come on to why that is in a second, but I think the reason why I think your article is so important is because it raises a much more fundamental issue. The reason why I don't think this is a very difficult issue to deal with is that I'll give you an example. So I work with the National Defense University in Washington, and there was this issue. They said, well, how are we going to stop people writing essays using ChatGPT, right? And I was like, well, can't you just get them to come in physically and write it with a pen? These are like colonels or major, you know what I mean? These are quite relatively, middle-ranking military officers. They should just be able to write with a pen and paper. So now, hopefully they've done that. Actually, we're done with NDU. I need to go and double check. But I think what the problem here is I think you just need to get people to do oral exams, to do written exams, and do that kind of thing. And what your article did, which I thought was really important, it made me think about it. Is I think what this actually reflects is a fundamental unseriousness at the universities. If they were really serious about producing high quality people, rather than just responding to commercial imperatives. And I understand why, because we all have to. I remember when I was thinking about the ref, or I was thinking about, money and all the rest of it. I totally get all of that, but it's a fundamental unseriousness. And I just want to make one last point, and I apologise for going on.
Not at all.
Which is that I don't think we can afford this level of unseriousness anymore. And the reason I say that is I'm just going to give you some, dare I say, some facts that I looked up on the internet before I came in. These are from Georgetown. So it's just in 2020, this is the number of STEM
This
graduates.
is Georgetown University.
Georgetown
in
University, yeah, in Washington. Apologies. Right. So this is from 2020. China had 3.6 million STEM graduates, right? So this is people who science, technology, engineering, mathematics. India, 2.6 million. The US, 820,000. Russia, 520,000. France, 220,000. Germany, 216,000. Japan, 192,000. And we were so low down the list in Britain, we weren't even on their list of the top 11 countries. Right? Now, just to put this into perspective, Chinese manufacturing is at scale now, is so much better than everybody else's advanced manufacturing that they are going to eviscerate our industries if we can't compete with them. Right, in the physical world. American weightless technologies like AI, NVIDIA, which is just one of their companies, is now worth the same market capitalization as every single top 40 French company, plus every single top 40 German company. Right? We have to compete in this world, and if we don't produce, if we're not more serious, we can't get to grips with the sort of things you're talking about, Daisy. And if we don't, in my opinion, also produce more people who can do maths, engineering, science, then I think we are in enormous trouble as a country.
Is this a uniquely British problem? Because in many ways, Britain has quite a lot of strengths in terms of, you've come from it yourself, Nick, in terms of AI that's been developed in this country. Are we talking about something that's specifically British, that there's a specific unseriousness about this country?
I'll take that. So I completely agree with everything Nick said, and I think fundamental unseriousness is absolutely the phrase. That it just baffles me that we are years into this now, this problem. And as Nick says, actually, there are some relatively simple solutions. You could just do a lot more in-person written exams, back up with oral exams, systems where you say we're going to randomly sample 5-10% of you after every essay to read it out, like you say.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of things you could do that are not that difficult, but there is absolutely no appetite for any of those, it
So
seems.
why is there no appetite for it?
So and then if you want to take that question you said about, is this uniquely British, where are we with it, why is there not? I mean, there are some obviously specific British aspects to the particular issue around cheating, but there are some things here which are global. I don't know enough about Chinese university.
Sure.
I mean, there are a lot of things there where people say they have issues there with peer review papers, with a lot of problems with those. So you've got to factor that in too. So I think there are some genuinely global issues here with universities that go beyond just the British experience. And then I think there are some specific British issues probably about STEM, which we could discuss. The global issues with universities is why I think actually the Catholic Church is such a good analogy, medieval Catholic Church, because the medieval Catholic Church is cross-national. You know, it's not just in one country. And actually you're seeing very similar things in Germany and in England and what have you. And I think actually the analogy with universities and medieval Catholic Church is very similar, because they are extraordinarily resistant to pressure for change on a whole range of issues. Like not just this, but lots of other things. And at a time when the rest of the world is changing so fast and there's so many ways we need universities, like we desperately need their expertise and the things they can bring to the table, it just feels incredibly frustrating to me that they're not doing that and they're not changing in line with what we need.
And what would you like to see?
Yeah. Well, the obvious, really concrete one would be something on this, something on assessment that... And this is why I would say structurally, they're in this country, but I think also abroad, they're quite decentralised, and individual professors do have quite a lot of autonomy in how they set assessments, for example. I would, on this front, I mean, my day job is in assessment. I am constantly astonished at the difference between school assessment and university assessment. So school assessment in this country is really not bad. There's lots of good things about it. Also, international assessments of school education are pretty good. We have organisations like PISA, TIMSS. You know, you have a pretty good idea, both internally of how kids do on GCSEs and A-levels in England, and also internationally how they compare to students in other similar countries. You have so little of that in universities. I think for a lot of subjects, there is a strong case. What's really interesting, you have this for medicine. So for the subjects where it kind of really matters, we do it. But everything else, it's just still quite cottage industry. So for medicine, there is a strong centralised element of there are certain things, wherever university you graduate from, there are certain things you have to have in common. You just don't have that for other subjects.
But that's really interesting, isn't it? Because that's literally a life and death matter medicine.
I know.
And so when things matter, people are serious. So this reflects the fact that for a lot of subjects, we don't take them seriously.
Right.
Should we take them seriously? Perhaps there are subjects, perhaps there are courses being done now that we shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, potentially. And I think this feeds into wider things around, again, what is a university for? If it is designed to help students get jobs and be economic actors, is it fulfilling that function? Is there another function of it? One of the problems is the university has a lot of different functions. And one of the problems that we're talking about here is a lot of professors, I think, they're not necessarily maybe really that committed to teaching. They're more interested in research. And actually, you know what? In a certain extent, fine. Like the university is also a research institution. We want people doing good research. And then you say, well, it is good for researchers to be passing on knowledge to students. I get that. But you have got to a point, I was talking to someone involved in university administration. They were saying if you can't give a professor a pay rise, what you want to do is reduce their teaching load. You know, that's a benefit. That's seen as a perk to reduce their teaching load.
Certainly is.
Right. Okay. So maybe one of the things you could think about is if we really want to be the education function of universities, of educating the next generation, and the research functions, are they separate? And do we need to maybe be emphasising that separation and be emphasising people who really do want to teach and really do want to be focused on how you improve students' thinking and how you improve how you assess them? rather than leaving it to professors who perhaps would be rather interested in research.
To do so anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that what your piece really made me think about, that I hadn't really thought about before, is that actually I think that this is in many ways quite a straightforward problem. This is a new technology. This new technology has caused a problem. It's like, refrigerators, and it's caused a hole in the ozone layer, and then you all come together and you say, well, we'll stop using so many aerosols and replace CFCs with HFCs or whatever. This is
that's a scientist's answer.
There we go. But this has just created a new problem, and I completely agree with you that if everyone's cheating, then it devalues the whole enterprise. So it seems quite straightforward to me, actually, that you just need to sort out this problem. And I think all of these other things are also important, and I'm very keen that we go on to it. Yeah. But for example, like as you said, there are many functions to university, and the way I've always thought about it is that in some senses, university is a bit like an Olympics. You're trying to find the cleverest people who will go off and do stuff. It's also about giving people skills and expertise, and that's also important. Education, so people know, about, dare I say it, the English Civil War or whatever, Paul. And then there's another function which is also important, which is keeping people off the streets, right? Which is where we've got to now as well.
That is one of its primary functions.
And that is now, didn't used to be, but it now is to some extent keeping people off the streets. And that is a third function, and that is an important thing as well. But I would just say, though, that all three of those functions are devalued by this. And I actually think that this is just a relatively straightforward problem that we need to sort out, because this is why I say the fundamental unseriousness. If there's an obvious problem, you just should, and you're not sorting it out, then it's just a bit silly.
Well, so I agree with you in that it is one of these examples of something where you're right, there is a fix. But so I agree with you in that sense, it is straightforward. But where it kind of isn't straightforward is I have absolutely no confidence that the universities are going to do this. And that's why it's such a problem. And what it reminds me of, there's a kind of a similar thing in the civil service at the minute. I was reading some stuff. A lot of this ties up with, civil service and elites and how you educate and examine people going to the civil service. There's a long-standing problem with the civil service that people move around jobs too often. And it's been flagged up in numerous reports for decades, like arguably going back to a big landmark 1968 report the Harold Wilson commissioned. And yet it's still going on. And you're like, this is quite a simple problem. Like, there are other problems that afflict the civil service that are more difficult. This is quite a simple one. Like, why are people moving jobs every year to 18 months when everybody agrees that's a problem? Like, how have you not fixed it? And so that's where I agree with you. It is a straightforward issue that we know the answers to, but we also, all of us, I think, have very little confidence that it is going to be fixed. And arguably, like, that is the problem. It's like this institutional problem of how do you get these organisations to change.
And Daisy, you've spoken about something similar of this before when you first became a teacher.
Yeah.
And you were struck by some of the methods that were being used then. Yeah. And you just thought, this is preposterous, and started pushing back. Yeah. And then you had a change, which I think is pretty much universally agreed, that it improved education in England and Wales, at least. Yeah. We're looking for something similar, presumably, in the university sector. Yeah. Do you get any sense that people are waking up to this as people woke up to it in secondary schools?
So I don't. And I think, again, you can't separate this issue from the institutional issue, which is that you've got a lot of powerful institutions that are quite decentralised, and a lot of individual professors having quite a lot of control over syllabus and assessment. And so it's quite hard to know what the levers are to pull. So in the case of the school education reforms you talked about, you could arguably say, actually the groundwork of this was laid decades ago, but you did have a national school assessment system. And that was a very important lever that the government could pull. And I would argue was the more important lever than curriculum. Curriculum gets a lot of the attention, but it's actually assessment, I always say, where the rubber hits the road. And so the government were able, and I think an incredibly far-sighted reform by Gove, more important than any of the curriculum reforms.
This is Michael Gove, the Education Secretary.
Was to get rid of coursework. So coursework is basically non-examined assessment. And by the time he got rid of it, it was making up 60% of GCSE exams. So quite a lot.
And was cheating an aspect to that coursework as well? I mean, obviously, this is long before large language models.
And I opened the article I wrote for you, I opened with my experience of teaching in that era. So when I started teaching, I taught English. When I started teaching, it was 40% of the GCSE. Within a couple of years, it had gone to 60%, and then Gove got rid of it, and it went to zero at GCSE. And in those days, there weren't LLMs, and this is what I'm saying, this was in the pre-democratic era of cheating. And so one of the things you would see a lot is a student with an older brother or sister could just and what you saw then where the technology was starting to help the cheating was obviously word processed answers. And what you would see then is it just made it harder if you couldn't see the handwriting. So if you knew a student's handwriting and they hand in something that's different, obviously hang on a minute. But if it's all word processed, if they've just reproduced, they've just literally printed off what their brother or sister wrote 2 years ago, you had no idea. What do you do in that situation? So yes, I think there was a lot of cheating. There was a lot of analysis done in 2012 showing sort of differential patterns of scores in coursework and the exam elements, which I think did kind of prove there was a lot of, if not outright cheating, then, a lot of slightly dodgy stuff going on. So I think Gove was absolutely right to do that. And that's a really far-sighted thing to do. And just for an example of someone doing the opposite, the Republic of Ireland did the opposite after COVID. So after COVID, they decided we actually need a bigger teacher-assessed element. And they did a big reform process to bring that in. And kind of as they were bringing it in, ChatGPT hit. And they've now got a big problem. They've done a big reform process that's just been kind of almost, I would say, just blindsided by large language models.
But the solution to the universities is essentially the same.
I think so.
As that happened
but
in the
what
schools.
is the lever to pull? Yeah. And the problem you've got is it is an institutional problem, because I follow a lot of academics on Twitter. All my Twitter and Substack seems to be academics complaining about students using LLMs, getting very annoyed with it. And I see lots of proposals that lots of them make about how we could fix it, and some of them implementing them. But the problem is that I see a lot of good proposals, I see a lot of bad ones. There is no mechanism whereby the good solutions can flow through the system and become the new equilibrium. And so, look, I don't want to come across as a massive sort of, free marketeer here, but if you look at that famous Friedrich Hayek paper from, I think, 1945, The Uses of Information in Society, the point Hayek makes, which is really important, and even if you're not a free marketeer, you have to take seriously, is that what the free markets and prices are very good at is allowing information to flow very freely and to help people make decisions based on new information. And I think the example he gives is something like, if you like drinking coffee, and coffee comes from a Brazilian coffee plant, and there's a hurricane that wipes out the coffee plantation in Brazil, the price of Brazilian coffee goes up. You don't have to know that there was a hurricane in Brazil. You don't have to be plugged in and reading the newspaper every day. You just see, oh my goodness, the cup of coffee I really like has doubled in price. I'll switch to another type of coffee, or maybe I'll drink tea, or I'll do something else, or I'll work harder because coffee is so important to me. You don't have to know about the hurricane. You don't have to know about the damage it's done. You don't have to know about any of that. You just need to kind of see the price, and that creates very flexible systems that are very responsive. I think what you have when you have, and I'm not saying we should privatise universities. What I'm saying is when you have institutions that don't have that mechanism for stuff being able to flow through them, you then have to think very seriously about the institutional design as to how they will update and change when new things happen. And arguably school education is not perfect and can still be quite clunky and unresponsive. But in school education, at least you do have, most countries, some levers you can pull, which, as I say, are not as responsive as the price, but still give you something.
But I think you're entirely correct, which is always disappointing for a podcast. So I apologise, Paul. And I think it's interesting you talked about 1945 as a time point, because there are really, in many ways, in Britain and in America and a number of other countries, but particularly Britain and America, because they've had less disjointed domestic political regimes in some ways. Yeah. There was a key period of reform in the mid to late 19th century. So in Britain, for example, you had Gladstone, who was a liberal. Bit more like Margaret Thatcher in some ways. We can have a whole discussion about that. But and he brought in elementary schools and a variety of other things. And you talked about the civil service, reforms to the civil service. He brought in a lot of the things from Northcote Trevelyan Act and so on, or report rather. And so his was a reforming government, right? And there were others, Peel and so on. Then 1945 in Britain, that's a reforming government. And in America, you have 1933 with FDR. And then, of course, you have the late 70s, early 80s, right? And I think in each case, there was a disjuncture. And I think that was, and it required reform. And partly that was because there was an imperative to reform, because you reach the point, which I think we've reached now, where the system isn't working very well. And it's not just this. This, in some ways, is an example of a much broader set of challenges we face. I don't think we're doomed as a country, and a lot of people are very miserabilist, but I think that's where we are. But we face a range of challenges right? Where we no longer have the luxury of being fundamentally unserious about things, because we face, America essentially with its weightless industries, and we face China with its physical industries that are just simply superior to ours. So I strongly suspect actually that this is just one example of a much broader set of issues. You talked about Michael Gove. I think you often need leadership. You need ideas. So you need alternatives people can grasp onto. Actually, you look like, Thatcher didn't come out. Her ideas didn't come out of thin air. There was a lot already going on. Right. The same with FDR. He had a brains trust of people.
Well, in many ways, we just mentioned Jim Callaghan, who anticipated Thatcher in many ways as well, in terms of realising the problem, if not the solution.
I mean, it was or Ted Heath beforehand. In many ways, he wanted to do a lot of what Thatcher did. He just failed, and then had the Barber boom, and it all went horribly wrong. So actually, I think that what this is to some extent is we are now in a period again where countries that are vigorous enough to continue to renew themselves, which hopefully Britain is, again, as we have been a number of times before, they are able to reform themselves. And this is a good example of something that is obviously silly, for which there are relatively straightforward solutions. And if we can't do it, it's a bit... I wrote down Scargill here. I just wanted one last example. And I'm not I'm not a Thatcherite. Arthur Scargill, but it became silly. He did not want any mines closed, however exhausted the mine was. So the idea is you would continue mining even if you were essentially mining mud. It's obviously stupid. Once you get to the point where something is obviously ludicrous and you're still not reforming it, then you're in a real pickle and you have to move forwards. And I think that is, to some extent, where I think this is a wonderful illustration of a broader set of issues. Yeah.
Can I just raise two things here? Daisy's raised the issue of the public-private divide here with your Hayek and the civil service. It's both universities in Britain certainly are largely public sector institutions, as is the civil service, both of which, well, I think all three of us believe are failing in some way or are not optimum, shall we say. And then there's also you raise, because you're a former English teacher, you're a neuroscientist. I want to get in these two divisions between public and private and humanities and science, and the tensions that are there, and whether one is better suited to those challenges than the other, whether it's private, public, or it's STEM and humanities.
Can I answer? Can I leap in?
Of course.
Just say, I'll be very brief, which is just, it's obviously both. It's obviously public and private, and it's obviously arts and sciences. There we go. So we can finish it like that.
If I talk about the public-private, because I think about this quite a lot, there are obviously examples of the private sector and free markets kind of failing. And I think if you're going to say what is one of the weaknesses, I outlined the strength of the free market and prices, and I am a big prices person. I think they are incredible, and I think we underestimate their power. But if you want the kind of the weakness, obviously, of the free market case, and the weakness, you could say, maybe of the post-Thatcherite settlement, it's that I think there are cases where you probably should privatise. But let me take a little example. And this is another example of something that is so basic that you feel you must be able to fix this. And if you can't fix it, it brings so much health into disrepute, which is the fact that it takes 6 months to get a driving licence, a driving test in the UK at the moment. And there was a backlog built up after COVID and people just haven't got rid of it. And so you've got all these crazy situations where you've got bots who will just go on and grab all the new appointments as they arrive and then sell them on for more money. You've got people who desperately need to drive for their job, who can drive, who just need the licence, but need the test, can't book a test. If you fail once, you're waiting like another 6 months. Yeah. It's such a basic, fundamental kind of aspect of a modern state to me that it should be able to provide its people with a driving test. It's not that complicated. So, and also the other thing is, all the problems that you've got with it, you can make a complete Hayekian critique of them all, right? Is that you can say, this is the kind of thing that if you had a free market, you would not get this absurd queue. it's a queue you've got. If you had a free market and you just let the free market rip, you'd get the queue down to nothing overnight. The blockages in the system would just be washed out. You would have independent contractors setting up. But we also know that is not a solution because you also need a standard. The whole point, and this is why it overlaps a bit with my interest, my day job, testing. Tests, you do need a central authority to provide a standard and stop the race to the bottom. So the Hayekian free market solution here doesn't completely work because the quality would degrade and you would have independent contractors setting up to offer tests. You would have a flood of new supply, brilliant, but they'd all be competing on lowering quality and you'd have people going out on the road unable to drive. So you've got like a situation where at the minute the state is kind of providing the whole system itself and is doing a bad job of it. We've got a system, an alternative is to privatise it. I think you can't just let that rip. If you were going to privatise it, you need a heavy dose of regulation. You would do what the British state has done a lot of in the past few years, is you could outsource. So for something like the driving test, which again, pretty basic, we're not talking about to be fair, Ajax tanks, these new tanks that they can't do, at least that is quite complex. This is a driving test. What are your options? You run it yourself, you manage it yourself as the state. You privatise and regulate, or you outsource. But all three of those things require some form of state capacity, right?
And leadership.
Yeah, they all require state capacity. And I think the weakness of the free marketeers was that, in particularly sort of the late Thatcherite era, is they just thought we can privatise and forget. I think there's an apocryphal thing where you'd say, the best council is one that meets twice a year to allocate the contracts. If you do that, you will get contractors who take the mick out of you, right? So the point is, there is an argument for all three things. For the state to run something like that itself, just do it in-house. For the state to privatise and then regulate, or for the state to outsource. All three of those require some smart people at the centre doing something, having capacity, having expertise, and we lack that.
So can I just say, I think the other aspect of that is there was a wonderful analogy that Winston Churchill gave about, I can't remember about politics, government, but it's like a sailing ship. So you need to, you need to heel to one side to charter a middle course. And so I think that what Margaret Thatcher inherited was to some extent, 1945 we needed more planning to some extent. In 1980 we needed, or 1979 we needed less planning. And what I strongly suspect now is that you're right, that we have eroded our state capacity. If you try and book a room right, give you two practical examples. If you try and book a room to have a meeting in the Ministry of Defence, it's an absolute nightmare, right? I won't go into the details, right? And if you try and change anything at all in University College London Hospital, right, to go and doctor's office, that again is an absolute nightmare, right? So I think what we need to do is build up state capacity. And that, for example, I think will involve things like building new organisations that can build that capacity. So to give you an example, I think we need new educational organisations, a bit like in France, they had the ENARCs, which they've now got rid of or rebranded.
Don't say Anglo-Gaullism.
No, I'm not going to say Anglo-Gaullism. Partly for a wide variety of reasons. No, but I think we need a more effective state. And this is exactly what now, precisely how you get to that is dependent on the context. So I think you see that in the mid-19th century. You see that in 1945 and you see that in the 70s and 80s.
Right.
And it's contingent upon what are the challenges, which way you should heal the...
So I think this leads on nicely to the, we've done the public-private, this leads on nicely to the humanities STEM that you were talking about. So on the public-private issue, what I think you need is, I think planning, I prefer the phrase state capacity than planning, because I think planning does have issues, like it really does. I think the state capacity of just in that simple example of the driving test is for me kind of what you need to be looking at. And I think what this also ties into, to go back to the Hayek point, is even when you don't have free markets, what the price provides you is feedback. So if you don't have a free market and you've decided for whatever reason we're going to do the driving test in-house, you need some feedback mechanisms, right? And I will say that what was interesting is I think Thatcher's take was just to say, just privatise. And I think, as you say, there were legitimate reasons to think that at the time. I think actually New Labour did do some interesting thinking on if, given that we're not actually going to privatise education and health, we need to try and make them work better. What are your feedback mechanisms in the absence of a price? And New Labour did do some serious thinking about targets. And, Michael Barber in education, lots of people in health, the target essentially has to stand in for the price. you need to have people at the centre being able to have some idea of like what is going on, right? And how you design those targets, and there were all issues with them. They're clunky. I started my career in teaching where there's some very clunky, badly designed Blair era targets. So, and then you had a system under Gove where I think he reformed some of those targets, made them smoother, made them better. It's not that you ever have perfect, but you can incrementally improve. So I think you've got to recognise that. For me, that feedback loop is really important. And then obviously, Michael Barber was a very central advisor to Blair, a big advisor under Gove and Boris, and who gets all the attention is obviously Dominic Cummings. He talked a lot about needing some kind of central place in the Cabinet Office, a nerve centre, where you've got data coming in and you're kind of able to see how a lot of these things are working. I think there is something around dashboards, being able to get data out of systems, be able to see what is going on. There's a bit of a theory now of the idea of the database state. The bits of the state that work well are the bits that have databases that function. The bits of the state that work badly are the bits where people are still pulling things into Excel. So to go back to your STEM humanities thing, I think there is something around. We can talk a lot about how maybe, AI is we don't need coders anymore. I tend to look at this as maybe AI might eliminate a lot of coding jobs, but it's the same as if AI, means that people don't have to write. You're still going to have to learn to write because writing is a tool for thinking. And I think there is a case that we maybe need more people to understand the structures of databases, how to analyse statistics, how to interpret dashboards and graphs. We're going to still need more of that. You need the people to have that because it's a tool for thinking. Yeah. It's a tool for understanding what's going on in your system. So I would say something like that. I was involved a little bit in the early days setting up the London Interdisciplinary School, which is one of the first universities in England for a long time. And their idea was every student would have to do some sort of coding and stats module. And I don't want to overclaim I'm not as in touch with them now. I think they're doing a great job. So I don't know how much that's lasted. But for me, that kind of thing is very important. That I think it is, writing is a tool for thinking. And that's why even if the LLMs can do your writing for you, you still need to learn to write. But I honestly think the world we're in, statistics is a tool for thinking, interpreting graphs, understanding graphs. That's why I found it so worrying when the head of the COVID inquiry, and maybe she was just saying it to kind of be polite and put people at their ease, but she said, "Oh, don't worry, I really struggle with graphs too." Yeah. And I just felt, for the COVID inquiry, graphs were so central to COVID. Yeah. I just feel to me that I worry about that. So you're talking about the STEM humanities. I think there is an issue around, people talk about PPE as being the pipeline into government. I think there's also obviously a lot of lawyers. I think there does have to be a bit more of an understanding. I would say I think statistics are important. And statistics, the other thing is, they're not super hard. When you look at the maths A-level, the components of it, statistics is generally accepted as being the easiest module of the maths A-level, right? The one that if you just work hard and are diligent, you can ace it. The pure modules are harder. So I'm not even saying here we have to do loads of hard stuff. I'm just saying we need people to have a bit more of a facility with this, because I do think that it's a vital aspect of state capacity for all the reasons I've talked about.
No, absolutely. But even then, we can't escape. I mean, that's a good example of the melding of science and humanities.
Exactly.
There.
Yeah.
But even then, when we've harvested the best data we can have and we understand it, it still depends upon judgment and leadership.
So and Nick, obviously you do stuff in defence. The classic argument kind of against when you just have a total data mindset is the Vietnam War, the best and the brightest, Robert McNamara. These guys are all staring at spreadsheets and don't really have any feel for what's happening on the ground. So the real power of mathematics and statistics is its abstraction. And abstraction is a danger. You abstract it and you just think, you just think, well, I can compare any standard deviation with any other standard deviation. It's like, well, you can't. You have to know something underlying about what it is you're comparing. The favourite example I always give of this is debates about the best sportsman ever. You can put them all on a standard deviation and Don Bradman is miles ahead of anyone. And then your pushback is it fair to compare a guy who was playing a sport that only kind of a few countries were playing in an era that was, a bit semi-pro?
The answer is obviously yes.
Yeah, I know. I am too. But, people can push back. People can push back and say, actually it's Simone Biles. That's how much she's doing that. She's achieving 4 standard deviations in a much more competitive field. You can have the argument. But my point is, you're not going to solve that argument just with your standard deviation. Your standard deviation is a really powerful tool.
That's a really interesting point, because it's just, keeping a sporting analogy, again, I was just watching football at the weekend and looking at 2 people who had a very close relationship. One is Pep Guardiola, manager of Manchester City. The other is Mikel Arteta at Arsenal. And just the manner, both stats-based, heavily stats-based, as is all Premier League football now, as is all football. Both would presumably have a mastery of those stats, or their coaching teams would have a mastery of their stats. But in the end, as we reach the business end of the football season, it's the demeanour of Pep Guardiola that represents something that Mikel Arteta, the disciple, doesn't appear to have. And so how do you quantify that? How do you know, all that quantified stuff has been done, but then
it's true.
There's that tip of the iceberg that is leadership.
That's true. I mean, I think I know what you mean. I think people are a bit harsh on Arteta. I think they're still probably favourites to win the title, I would say. I don't know. We'll see, won't we? But what is really good about that analogy is these guys, modern footballers, modern managers, they've got to be good at everything. So if you want another military analogy, it's a bit like these big debates about all arms conflicts in the Second World War. And people are like, oh, is it naval and sea power? Oh, no, you're going to need land. Is it just the land? It's like you need everything. You need absolutely everything. And you need to be really good at absolutely everything. And you need to be really good at integrating absolutely everything. And in highly competitive fields, that's what you need. And that's what Arteta and Guardiola, both of them really, they are very good. They do everything well. They integrate everything well. And they create teams that are like incredibly hard to beat. So you just need to be doing it all. And that's the thing with the STEM and humanities. Like, you need it both. And what you also need is individuals cannot have all that expertise within them. So then what you have when an individual can't have all that expertise themselves is you have institutions. And you have institutions where you have to bring together all the different domains of expertise. But when you do that, they have to have a shared language to talk in. Now, one shared language is obviously language, but my argument is another shared language is obviously some basic element of maths and statistics. And again, another thing that kind of worried me when they leaked those COVID WhatsApp messages, there was that bit where Boris Johnson confused 0.04 and 0.04%. Like, that's a factor of 100. That's a big deal. And he went on pushing it. Now, to be fair, all his advisors jumped on him and said there's a difference between 0.04, 0.04%. But he was really insistent. And what worries me about that is the language. That is as important as language. That is the language you have to be able to have discussions with. I'm not saying your Prime Minister needs to be an expert statistician. Yeah. I'm saying like there is a threshold they have to meet to be able to have the discussions with the people who are experts. And that for me, when you're thinking about creating like new elites, and this is when we were setting up LIS, we had some really interesting discussions about this, is like what level, what threshold do you have to be getting to be able to understand and engage in these debates. And you don't want it to be like you just have this surface level understanding that you're just a bluffer. You still need also to be pushing up in some areas where you're a complete expert, but you need to have like a modicum. You need to be filling up buckets at different levels. And again, maybe like all arms conflict is a thing. You don't get chiefs of the general staff who are from outside the military, but they have to come from one of the services. They can't be experts.
You must come across this all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and this is a major theme at the end of my book, which is about how can we make wiser choices. So, we can be clever. Yeah. Right, you can be very, very clever in particular expert areas. Like, I don't want a plumber to remove my gallbladder. I want and equally, precisely, I do not want. It's very expensive sounding alternative. And so what you often need then is exactly people who are more generalist. And so, but being a good generalist is not the same as being a bluffer. And there are things we can say about that. So essentially, part of that is like you look at Winston Churchill, for example, and he was somebody who had a broad knowledge. So he could bring many different models, many different areas of expertise to bear. He could also ask penetrating questions. So he would dig down into specific, really deep questions. Right, that seem very nitty gritty and below, the pay grade of literally a prime minister in wartime, but actually that gives you an element of sort of ground truth, using a more American term, that you need. I thought your points about models was good, because the thing is, all models are wrong, but some models are
That's
useful.
That's my favourite line.
You need, and so. What you need is that broader sweep, and I think you can only get that actually from history when you get to that really top level, and you can plus.
And
I completely
Churchill,
agree.
the great exemplar of
but also, for example, you look at someone like Eisenhower. So Eisenhower is one of my favourite US presidents. Eisenhower was not enormously successful at this point. Mid-ranking American officer, and he got sent to Panama, and. This was not a plum posting at all, but he was basically there was a key mentor he had there who made him read lots of history, and also Shakespeare and a variety of other things. And that gave him a wide range of different analogies or models to put next to each other and compare, so he could make better choices in the future.
Yeah.
Right, and bear in mind, he then went on. He was the guy who founded DARPA or ARPA then, right? The people who invented the internet, the defence, well, it was then the Advanced Research Projects Agency, right? So he was very keen on science. He also loved psychology. So one of the key things he wrote when he was chief of the staff immediately after World War II was he wrote to the people at West Point and said, I think we need more applied psychology in your course and so on, right? So he was a man of very wide interests who could draw on all of those to make wiser choices. Yeah. Right, and I think that is what we need, and I think there is another aspect to this, which is age. So there are some people who are brilliant, Pitt the Younger or Napoleon or whatever. Yeah. But actually, I think if you look at David Cameron, for example, he was probably just too young to be Prime Minister. Yeah. And I actually think it's the same thing with Barack Obama in many ways. Right, same thing with Tony Blair. Like You could same thing with Churchill probably if he'd been and also of course he then became too old and had a stroke and that was a bit of a disaster. He wasn't reforming anything in that second prime ministership. So I think now we can say a lot about how people can make wiser choices and how we can educate people to make wiser choices, how we can get institutions that can help them make wiser choices. Again, I think the issue is, how do we get people to do that? This comes back to your original your original point that I think your article highlighted beautifully. How do we get people to make these reforms? And again, the thing I would add to yours is that I don't think there's one simple way forwards for that. So to give you an example, you're absolutely right on integrating institutions. Yeah. So in Britain, for example, we had the Cabinet Office set up in World War I, where there were powerful civilians so that the military would not be overmighty within our system. Yeah. The Germans didn't have that. The general staff was too powerful, and once Bismarck had gone, who was the leader who managed to rein them in, they didn't make wise decisions. They made decisions that were expert, but unfortunately expert in the single domain of the military. Yeah. But that said, a friend of mine works on these things at Princeton, and he was like, civilizations collapse. And one of the ways they collapsed, like the Roman Empire, one of the ways the Roman Empire collapsed was you get more and more and more and more people who are integrating and not doing anything actually useful, more and more layers of integration, which is, I think, what we've got a lot in the British government. And actually, a lot of that could probably be done away with.
Well, the history point is an interesting one, obviously, to me as a historian. But I was at both the Munich Security Conference and the London Defence Conference that's just been on. And I was at various panels. And one of the things that really struck me, this is why I was so impressed by your piece that started this, was the historical analogies going back to the 16th century. Because both in Munich and in London, and this is almost always the case, it's not criticisms of those places, you have the same small palette of historical analogies again and again. When talking about China, when talking about Russia, when talking about challenges, it's the Cold War, it's appeasement, it's Sarajevo, and there's almost nothing beyond there. The 19th century is barely mentioned. Anything before then is just a dead zone, unless someone will say, well, what about Thucydides? And that's it. That's the palette of what's there. But so that's obviously a problem. But I also wonder whether the quality of leadership is dependent upon huge contingent factors. So, for example, also, particularly at the London Defence Conference, where there was a large British element, there were two things I thought. One was a good thing, but it also became a bad thing. And that is listening to people from Moldova or Finland or Japan talk about national resilience. You then look where the UK is on a map and you think national resilience is not going to be at the core of a place that's so luckily located. I sat there thinking, is there anywhere in the world that in terms of defence is better situated?
America.
Than, well, I'm not even sure America is, because it's right next to Russia. I'm not even sure that. Border, but anyway, there is, it's a pretty good place to be. And I think that means that perhaps, so that's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing in terms that when the world takes a bad turn, we're often the last place to feel the impact of that.
Yeah, but then
We
it
can
was only
imagine
Britain.
it.
It was only Britain and its empire, and France and its empire that went to war for Poland in 1939.
Sure, yeah.
So,
but
so
after
I would just
a
say
long period of anticipation of what was to come.
Yeah, I mean, they did their best. I mean, it was a
Yeah,
very
no,
difficult
sure,
time.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. But the key point to this is this question of leadership is the contingency that once it gets so bad, the reforms come. Do you have to wait till it gets so bad before that happens?
I think you can tie this into my point about feedback. And actually, I think Anthony Eden, after the war, says this about both wars. He says, for democracies, the first few years are really tough because the material isn't there. Once everything gets flowing, actually, it's fine. But the first few years in both are really tough for that reason. I think it ties into my feedback point. I think that you have big institutions and successful institutions, and you're right, and you're a bit insulated and remote from the changes. You know, my hurricane in Brazil point, you're kind of insulated from it. It's affecting other people. So, you know, Finland are going to be mega responsive to stuff that's happening in the world. Of
course.
You're right. Like, actually, Britain just kind of doesn't have to be. And on the one hand, that's great. On the other hand, is there a risk that the problems just then store up, and they get so big? I'm really fond of that Adam Smith line. There's a great deal of ruin in a nation. You can afford to make a lot of wrong turns and missteps. There's not an infinite deal of ruin. And so that's why I would like more responsive institutions. And I think just on that point of feedback and responsiveness, prices are a form of feedback. In war, Eden is basically gesturing at this. The form of feedback is people dying, right? And like big military catastrophes. And I think Eden is right. That's why the first few years of war, not just for democracies, but all kinds of, all kinds of countries, is the first few years are horrible because that's when the reality and the myth kind of collide.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then there's that whole theory of war as a learning curve. And this is the thing you write about, okay? Which is that the societies that win wars are the ones who can just adapt to that and move through that learning curve like quicker and quicker. And get to the things that will work. And that's where, you know, you would think systems that can have that wider responsiveness will do better. But, like, it is really hard, I think, to be militaries in peacetime.
Yeah.
What is your feedback loop?
Well, I'll tell you what's changing. I mean, you're the expert on this, is that changing nature of war, that it's becoming more difficult to escape it. It just doesn't just happen over there. Yeah. It happens here.
But also, I think an important point here is that you need to just get rid of stuff, and change stuff. So to give you an example, right, George C. Marshall, he was in charge of the U.S. military. America didn't go to war obviously until Pearl Harbor, in 1941, December 1941. But he sacked almost all, like a huge number of generals at the beginning of in 1939.
It's almost Stalin.
So he purged them because they were the peacetime guys, right? And I think and I think this is another crucial thing. So to some extent, it does to some extent. The specifics of what you do doesn't matter so much as, I mean, obviously it matters, but that you need to have coherent reforms that are well thought through and well implemented. And to some extent, it doesn't matter whether they're more of the left or more of the right. They need to be done well. And I think this is actually, it's very similar with the Thatcher thing. I actually think she probably got a number of things wrong, but we needed radical change at that point, and she was capable of making that radical change. And I would just say, this is the thing. In Britain, one of the weird things, you're a historian, right? What people in Britain don't realise how unbelievably lucky we are in Britain, that we haven't really, we've had an evolving, or developing rather, domestic political regime since 1688. But we haven't really had a revolution. We haven't, nothing. There's no been rapid disjuncture, and that is extraordinarily unusual. Germany didn't even exist until 1871. Right, and so I think we need to think about this, and we have an incredible capacity to renew ourselves. We've done it 3 times in the last 150 years, and I think we'll probably do another one now.
Yeah, I mean that's a very good point about that continuity. But the constitutional continuity that you refer to there is, I don't think it's widely understood, not only by the wider public but by politicians themselves.
Oh yeah,
and James Marriott wrote a piece yesterday in the Times about character being important to politicians. But he made the statement, which I thought was a curious one, but an illuminating one, which was that he claimed that the current Parliament was the best educated there had ever been. And I thought this raised the point, does he mean best educated or does he mean most credentialed? Because we were having a discussion just before this about, well, it's arguable that the greatest British politician of the 20th century, Ernest Bevin, who I know you're a fan of, had no credentials whatsoever that were
not
academic.
even an O-level.
I mean, he
Whatever
left
they
school
were
at
before.
14.
School certificate.
Illegitimate son of a farmhand.
I think about this a lot because a little bit, again, my day job, education assessment, and I think he's right in terms of most credentialed. I also think another very well-educated, well-credentialed cabinet is Wilson's first and second
probably
governments.
The best of all.
Do you look at
them,
those and go, they were the high point of British governance? I think even Wilson himself might say they probably weren't.
No, it's an extraordinary cabinet.
So you do have that thing which comes back to, like, what are we educating our elites for? Like, what is it that they need? I think there is a point about, as I said, about the technical expertise. There is a point, you're absolutely right, as you said earlier, you do need some generalists, but you need those generalists to still have a degree of expertise in certain areas. I also think there's a couple of historical analogies. One of the well-worn one of World War II, and then one that's going to, like you, Paul, a 17th century one. One thing I think in terms of like reform that matters, you talked about Churchill. I find it really fascinating reading Alan Brooke's diaries for the first time a few years ago. Because,
they're marvellous.
Well, but Alan Brooke, I
Brilliant.
think, just strips away a lot of the Churchill myth.
Yeah, he does,
And you don't have to necessarily agree with Alan Brooke, you can think he's wrong. There's two things in particular I found really striking. There's one, and I think it was kind of edited, it was edited out of the first editions and it only came back in 2001.
Yeah.
There's one bit where he lays into Churchill. And obviously he's tired. Churchill's always waking him up at, like, keeping him up till 2, talking. There's one bit where he lays into Churchill and he says, if only the general public could see what a pompous, horrible, arrogant old man he is. He really does, like, lay in. He said, but on the other hand, he's our greatest hope, and 75% of him, you can sort of see him wrestling with it at night. And you sort of read it and go, oh my goodness, like, I didn't realise that. So that's one thing about, the political, this is basically the political military kind of control, the technical expert and the political leader. The other fascinating bit is they're having this constant toing and froing when it's in North Africa, when they're having some bad setbacks. And obviously early 42, like, people forget this, again with the Churchill myth, people forget Churchill was really unpopular. There was a vote of confidence against him in early 42, just before Singapore fell. Singapore falls, like, Churchill is in this, terrible moment. And Gaulle, we're not saying Anglo Gaullist today, but Charles de Gaulle says it's in 42 when he loses it. He's kind of, his spirit breaks. That's de Gaulle's, whether you agree or not. But 42 is clearly, like, an important year. And Alan Brooke and him having these constant arguments about the number of men in North Africa. And the constant argument they're having is that Churchill is saying, how come we've got 1 million men on the ration book, on the rations in North Africa, but you can only get like 100,000 in the field? Yeah. And Alan Brooke is so agitated by this, he adds a, like, postscript post-war, kind of explaining himself. And he's like, we were constantly having this argument, it drove me up the wall. And Alan Brooke's argument, which, like, a lot of modern historians I think will back him on, is essentially you've got a still not flesh strategy. You are actually trying to employ science to reduce the number of men who have to go into battle at the front. If you do that, you end up with a long tail.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And that is to be that's good.
Yeah, and Montgomery was very much the advocate of that.
But you can also say that, if you think of the army as an institution, a bureaucracy that can get flabby, there will be people in the army who think, I'd rather not be at the front line.
Of course, yeah.
And there will be people who will just think, but I'd rather have the thing. You still need, even if you've got a long tail, you still need some teeth.
Yeah.
And what I find interesting with those debates between Churchill and Alan Brooke is you can see they're both right. And if you just did leave it all to Alan Brooke, potentially, or not necessarily Alan Brooke, but you leave it up to individual, you probably will get a drift away from, like, the men at the front, the numbers you need at the front. And so you do need some political pressure. Someone from outside of it is going, what is going on here?
Yeah.
Like, we've got a lot of people here. How are we not getting enough in the front line? And that, for me, is just a really great historical example.
And it's leadership.
It's a great historical example of you need both, is what we said before. You do need both. You need the technical expertise of an Alan Brooke who is over the detail and is saying, look, this is what these men are doing. Like, of course you need repair mechanics, Like, do you want to get rid of your mechanics and put them at the front? But you do need the pressure from someone, like, outside that technical expertise, saying what's going on, like, give me the overview. And that is what makes a good institution.
But can I also give you another, and I think you're absolutely right, and another great example of that is before World War II. So we think if, you talk about Churchill, the Battle of Britain, RAF Fighter Command, which won the Battle of Britain, which was Hitler's first major defeat, the RAF didn't want to build RAF Fighter Command.
Yeah.
The RAF wanted to build because they did bombing, and so they thought what we need to do is get more and more effective bombers. They didn't want to do that, and it was civilians actually who forced them. They promoted a maverick, Dowding, and they forced them to do it. Yeah. And so, exactly, I think often we rely on teams of people.
I know.
For example, Attlee, Bevan. All of they were a team, and I think it's exactly the same.
But all wildly different personalities.
But strong personalities who could then work together. And it's as you say with Alan Brooks. I mean, I write about in my book. The thing about Alan Brooks is Churchill deliberately chose as a man somebody who would argue with him. Even Stalin,
that's
interestingly,
Correct.
Stalin. I mean, the man literally murdered loads of people, but he actually ran the war by committee, the Stavka, right? And he empowered people. The same thing with Mao. Mao actually. Again, not a man who, he was happy to purge everybody, even Zhou Enlai and all the rest of it at different times. But then he brought people in and used their insights when it was necessary. And that's something that, all great leaders can do. Yeah. And hopefully, whoever is leading us in the not too distant future will be able to do that.
Yeah.
Well, on that optimistic note, we can draw this fascinating conversation to a close. So thank you, Daisy Christodoulou, and Nick Wright. It's been brilliant.
Thank you for listening to the EI podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please sign up to our mailing list and download the Engelsberg Ideas app. Explore intelligent perspectives on history, culture and geopolitics anytime, anywhere. And best of all, it's totally free. Until next time, thanks for listening.